Welcome into the Monday Morning MotoGP Podcast live here on TikTok. Running a little bit late this morning, usually at 10 a.m. on the Monday after a MotoGP weekend, live here on TikTok, and then we repost the entire podcast in its entirety on YouTube later on today. So if you miss it live, don't worry, you can catch it on YouTube at Horsepower Rodeo. Make sure you're following here on TikTok, and then make sure you go over to YouTube and subscribe, help us grow there. And we do a little more long form stuff there. This stuff on TikTok's a little more short form, little recaps, fun videos. But over on YouTube, you get the full length podcast, longer recaps, all that good stuff. So check us out in both places. It's a big weekend in Barcelona. We had an insane sprint, a sprint that no one wanted to win. We had three people crashing out of the lead. First of all, we had some people leading the Barcelona Grand Prix, the Barcelona sprint, that I don't think a lot of us expected at the front. Yes, Raul Fernandez qualified third on the grid after the yellow flag situation. Basically, he had a yellow flag infringement, meaning he couldn't improve on his lap time. His lap time was scrubbed off. And then later they looked at it and said, actually, the yellow flag had already been lifted. He didn't go through a yellow flag. They reinstated his lap time. He goes third, his best starting position ever in MotoGP. But I don't think any of us thought he would stay there. He hasn't really shown that much in MotoGP to be considered a front runner. And the fact that this guy was very aggressive early in the race, I think he thought he had the pace to go to the front and disappear. I mean, when you watch the sprint race, you watch what Raul Fernandez did at the front. He basically got to the front pretty impatiently, pretty aggressively, and then checked out a little bit. Put a few bike lengths in immediately, but he could not hold it. Lost the front, goes down. Lead goes to Brad Binder. He does the exact same thing. Lead goes to Pecco Bagnaia. He does the exact same thing. No one wanted to win this race. Now, Barcelona is a notoriously tricky track. A lot of people who maybe are new to MotoGP watch this race going, whoa, that's not normal to have three people crash out of the lead of a race, especially a race that's only, 12 laps. But the thing you have to understand about the Barcelona track is that even from past years, everyone has always said the track is extremely low grip, meaning on the rear tire, the tire spins a lot as soon as you hit the gas. You're on the side of the tire a lot. You're going through the corner. You have to accelerate when you're leaned over. The track doesn't give a lot of grip, and so the tire kind of can spin up and spit you off sometimes. And the same goes for the front. If you push the front too hard, you don't have any traction on that front tire, and the front tire just slides out from under you. So you have to be extremely careful. What they're called a greasy track, a track that really feels like at any moment the bike can kind of just buckle underneath you. And I think that's what we saw in the sprint. And Aleix Espargaro said after the race, he was looking ahead of him at the riders. He said, there's no way we can keep this pace. Everyone's just taking way too many risks. And no one can keep this consistency and this pace and stay on two wheels. And he was right. He kind of sat there in fourth place and let everyone in front of him make the mistakes. And they did make the mistakes. Pecco makes a huge mistake. He said it. Aleix said he had the best seat in the house for it. He said, I could see Pecco was fast. He was faster than me, but he was taking a ton of risk to be that fast. And it didn't work out for him. Main Grand Prix was a little more measured, but we still saw a lot of overtaking. Again, overtaking at the front. We saw our front runners going to the front. Jorge Martin, who started poorly, I think he started from the 7th position. We saw him move forward. We saw Pecco at the front. Marc Marquez charging through again. And a lot of people keep saying, oh man, MotoGP this season is so good. Why is that? And it's this dumb talking point that I keep coming back to, which is when you have a rider like Marc Marquez, who's not on the best machinery, who's not qualifying first and second, it's exciting because we know he's good at racing a motorcycle. We know he's an extremely talented racer. And so when he gets on the track with other riders, he can look at what the riders in front of him are doing and do it better than them. So the fact that he's starting in the mid-pack and not just starting at the front and disappearing means the sport is more competitive. Because you're not just having the fastest guy. There's not just one fastest guy who starts first at pole position and then disappears into the sunset. which happens a lot in motorsports. It happens in Formula One, it happens in MotoGP, happens in Moto America. We see this. The pole position is the fastest guy on the track. It makes sense that you start from pole position, you get a good start, and no one can touch you because you're the fastest guy by definition. But now we have one of the fastest guys who's still adjusting to the bike, who's on the second or third best bike on the grid, and he has to fight through the pack. And so he's not just starting from the front and disappearing. Then you have two very, very talented riders in Pecco Bagnaia and Jorge Martin that have the exact same bike, who are both extremely competitive right now. So neither of them are kind of letting each other get away. And then you kind of have the wild cards depending on the track. And this track happens to be an Aprilia track and an Aleix Espargaro track. So he's going to be there in the mix because he's got that home field track advantage. So then all those factors kind of come in. You have a very talented guy coming from mid-pack forward. You have two competitive riders who won't let each other get away with anything. And then you have our wild card riders like the Pedro Acosta, the Aleix Espargaro. I thought this weekend Maverick Vinales. Those guys can kind of keep it tight as well. And now you have 5 or 6 guys that can win a race, rather than just there's a fastest guy on pole position, he will win, race over, and everyone else is fighting for second. That's not what we're getting this year. And I think part of that is the fact we have 2 of the best riders on the grid riding the same bike. That really does help. When you think about the glory days that everyone is just wishing for so much, a lot of those fights were between teammates. You think about Jorge Lorenzo and Valentino Rossi. They were on the same bike. They were both extremely talented riders at the top of their game on the same bike. So now we have Jorge Martin and Pecco Bagnaia, 2 extremely talented riders on the same bike, which keeps it competitive. Some of them are going to be better at other tracks than Martin is going to have his strong tracks, and Pecco's going to have his strong tracks, and their strategy involved. Pecco seems a little bit better at managing his tires. Jorge just has this raw speed in the sprints that no one can match. Just when he goes full gas, he goes full gas. But they're both competitive on this ultra competitive machine. And they don't necessarily slow the pace, but they keep one guy from just ripping out front and just disappearing. So there's a lot of wild cardness in this season of MotoGP that leads to these super competitive races. Now, I will say I don't think Barcelona was the instant classic that maybe Austin or Jerez this year or France was. But it was still a pretty entertaining race because we did see it very competitive at the front. The top 3 very close once again. Aleix, I think, ran a pretty careful race on Sunday. I think he was, again, looking for, I don't want to make that big mistake and throw it down the road on a weekend that was very important to him. And so I think that's something we should talk about, because the speculation behind Aleix Espargaro's retirement before this weekend, as we're going into this silly season, we all know that we're kind of waiting for Ducati to make a decision of who's going to ride next to Pecco Bagnaia. The first piece of the silly season was, where does Fabio Quartararo go? He was the one rider that everyone could kind of see, riding for anywhere he wanted because he's that talented. And he's a free agent. He can go anywhere he wants. Well, when he re-signs with Yamaha, now the ball goes in Ducati's court. Who is going to ride next to Pecco Bagnaia? Because there's a bunch of dominoes that will fall depending on who they pick to ride next to Pecco. And we can talk about that in a little bit. But one of the things kind of holding up that train a little bit, or at least holding up the dominoes from falling after Ducati make that decision, was what's Aprilia doing? Because again, all these contracts are up. So in a sense, there's 2 vacant seats at Aprilia. Aleix didn't have a contract. Maverick doesn't have a contract. We don't know who's going to go there. So the speculation was Aleix wasn't having fun in MotoGP anymore. He wasn't being competitive in MotoGP anymore. And it was time for him to hang it up. I think Aleix is one of those riders where when he says things to the press, I tend to believe him a little more than some of the other riders. I don't believe anything that comes out of Marc Marquez's mouth in the press room. I think after the races is when he's the most honest. Before the race, it's all calculation. He said it in this press conference. I'm very clever and I will be continuing to be clever, because he doesn't just give us answers that are the truth. He gives us answers that help put him in a position to do what he wants to do. Post-race, adrenaline's running. You get a little more out of him that's truthful. But I think Aleix is one of those riders that kind of just doesn't hide very much. You see his interaction on track with other riders. The thing with him and Franco Morbidelli last year where he slapped him upside the head. The thing with Franco Morbidelli this year where they're complaining outside the steward's office. Aleix isn't shy to tell people how he feels. So I really actually do take it at face value when he says, over the last year or so, when I've packed my bags to go on a MotoGP weekend, to leave on Wednesday or Tuesday or whatever it is, to fly across the world and go on these weekends, I found myself wishing I could stay home. That's a big thing for someone as competitive as a MotoGP rider, someone who lives and breathes motorcycle racing. I think a lot of us take for granted what a grind this is for the riders. This is a 20-week schedule or 22-week schedule, what it's supposed to be, all over the planet. You're on planes constantly. You're traveling very far from home. We have races, the opening rounds. I mean, you start in Qatar, and then we're in Portugal, then we're in America, all over the planet. It's a grind on the riders, on the families, everything. And when you're a rider, you're hitting your mid-30s, you have some aches and pains from all the crashing, and you look and you've got your bags packed, you've got it over your shoulder, and you turn and you look at your family. And when you start having those pangs of, man, I wish I could just stay home this weekend, I think you do have to kind of look inside and go, man, do I still have the drive to keep going? And not to bring an American football reference, but one thing that popped into my mind was Brett Favre in the NFL. He was Mr. I'm retired, I'm not retired, I'm retired, I'm not retired. But the one thing he said that always made a lot of sense to me was, playing the game is easy. If it was just playing the game, I would play this till I was 60. But it's the getting up for practice, getting up for the meetings, committing all of that time to this sport and putting your body through training and rehab and, physical therapy and all the stuff you need to do that we don't see. We show up and we get to watch the game. And I think a lot of riders, if they could just show up on Sunday and play the game, I mean, you'd ride till you're 50. But you can't just show up and play the game. You have corporate sponsorship events on Wednesdays. You have media interviews, podcasts. You have media day on Thursday. Then you have practice Friday. Forget the travel days. Then you have Saturday qualifying, sprints, main races, Monday debriefs, flying home, training, practicing, getting out to the Rossi Ranch, whatever these guys are doing. There's so much that goes into being the MotoGP rider that happens outside of just riding on Sunday. A lot of these guys, it's a long commitment. It's a long season, even though it's kind of broken up, pre and post summer break. They have weeks off in between. When we say weeks off in between, we mean weeks off of racing. We mean weeks off of actually being in front of us and racing a motorcycle. But it doesn't mean they're taking a break. They're at home chilling. They're training constantly. They're bicycling. They're keeping their bodies in top shape. They're doing physio. They're doing mental coaching. They're out on production bikes on tracks. They're getting better all the time. So when Aleix says, listen, I would head out and I would just rather stay home. And I had to be honest with myself, is that the kind of mentality I need as a MotoGP rider? He doesn't think so. Not as a full-time MotoGP rider. But I want to be very specific when I say, listen to his words. Because he's saying it very carefully. He's saying, I'm retiring from being a full-time MotoGP rider, which doesn't mean he's done with MotoGP and done on the motorcycle. In fact, he was asked immediately, what's next? Of course he is. Someone's always going to ask, what's next? Right away. And I think a lot of people just assumed he would stick around with Aprilia. He's been the captain of the Aprilia ship for so long on that bike. They just assumed he would stay there. He'd be moving to a test rider role, help Aprilia win a world title. And when kind of asked that directly, I believe it was the Spanish media that asked him, are you considering test riding roles? And he said, yes, probably not with Aprilia. I think that shocked a lot of people. And it sent some shockwaves to the internet where people were like, oh man, there's some more stuff that's happening behind the scenes that we don't know about. They're forcing Aleix Espargaro. These rumors started flying immediately. As soon as he said that, oh man, Aprilia's not treating Aleix right. They're forcing him out. He wants to continue, but they're not letting him. First of all, I think if Aleix was very unhappy with Aprilia and how they're handling his retirement, we would all know about it. Maybe that's naive of me. Maybe I'm just being a little bit too like, well, they would tell us the truth. But I think what we've seen from Aleix in his past, I just feel like it would come out very quickly. Maybe not this weekend, but very quickly that Aprilia is forcing him out. I don't think he would stay super quiet about that. That seems like something that he would be saying immediately to anyone who would listen. So if that doesn't come out in the next few weeks, I think we can put that to bed completely. I'm putting it to bed now. I don't think Aleix is being forced out. I take him actually at his word, and I think he wants to be home. I think he wants to be running his restaurants. I think he wants to be bicycling. I think he wants to see his kids grow up. I don't think he wants to be away from home as much as he has been. Especially, you have to think about it. His kids are getting to school age where they're not going to be able to travel with him anywhere anymore. People like to forget that. Look at these races. He has his whole family. They get on the private jet. They fly all over the world. His wife, his kids are there every step of the way. Unless they consider homeschooling them, at a certain point, those kids are in school and they can't be out of school for Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So at a certain point, and this happens in all industries, you just can't bring your kids to work with you every day. And they're getting to that age. They will be very soon, if they're not already. Actually, oh, excuse me. They may be there. They may be at that age already, but I don't know anything about children. Anyway, but I don't think Aleix is being forced out of Aprilia. So why did he have that comment? Why did he say, I'm looking at test rider roles, probably not with Aprilia? And I think it's as simple as this. Aprilia was this chapter of his life. We saw Aleix at Suzuki. He moves over to Aprilia. He's the captain of that ship. He's had good times. He's had bad times. And I think he's kind of leaving on a high note. Did they win a world title? No, they didn't. But he did build that machine to be a competitive motorcycle. I think he says, or he thinks, I've done what I came here to do. The motorcycle is competitive. He himself admits, I'm not the most talented guy in the grid. I maybe work the hardest. I earn it. I earn my stripes here. But we didn't win a world title. But I do think I did what I came here to accomplish. Chapter closed. And I think he's the type of guy who's okay with closing that chapter and looking for a new one to open, looking for a new challenge to undertake. He knows what life at Aprilia is like. He loves those people. So I think that it doesn't really seem weird that he would be looking for challenges elsewhere in the MotoGP paddock. The other thing you need to take into account is Aleix Espargaro's love of sushi. If you don't know, Aleix owns sushi restaurants. He's a huge sushi fan. He loves Japanese cuisine. So I ask you, for someone who loves motorcycles and loves sushi, what better place for him than being a test rider at a Japanese manufacturer? He wants to stay home. He wants to be with the kids. Absolutely. But when he gets on that plane and goes to work, flying to Japan, spending time there, does that sound that bad? Splitting time between Spain and Japan, testing for Yamaha, testing for Honda, helping those programs get up to speed and be competitive with Ducati, with KTM, with Aprilia, being the guy that can come in there and not only fix one program, take Aprilia to be a winning motorcycle that most of the rest of the grid is really considering, hey, if I can't be on a Ducati, like the Aprilia is kind of the next best thing. It's near the front every week. Either Maverick's there or Aleix there. We saw Raul Fernandez there this weekend. And so him being able to take that knowledge and expertise that he had on that bike and go over and start a new chapter and put another feather in his cap of, look at what I can do. We've seen it with Dani Pedrosa already. Danny was a Honda legend. Danny won on the Honda, was very good, competitive in MotoGP, one of the best riders ever. And then he moves over to KTM. Now, whether that was Honda just wasn't interested in investing in Danny, didn't want to pay a salary. Maybe Danny was like, you know what? I've done my Honda thing. It's time for a new chapter. He goes over to KTM, and look at the accolades Dani Pedrosa has gotten from helping KTM get where they're at. He's getting a lot of credit over there. He's the living legend Dani Pedrosa that can come back in and compete as a wild card Still a super talented MotoGP rider that can ride near the front, even though he's riding 2 or 3 times a year rather than week after week. And I think Aleix is looking for that exact challenge. And what better place to do that than in Japan, a place he has passion for, love for, especially the cuisine. I could see him opening sushi restaurants or Japanese cuisine restaurants, Okinawan food, whatever, in Japan, testing at the testing facilities in Japan, being in Europe, close to his family, and splitting time there. He's not away from home 20 weeks a year anymore. He's away from home a handful of weeks, but when he is, he gets to be in a place he loves, doing a thing he loves. Doesn't seem that out of the ordinary for me. Who do I think is his landing spot between Honda and Yamaha? It's hard to say, because not that I've questioned Stefan Bradl's place at Honda, because it seems like, I mean, that motorcycle won a lot of races. And Marc Marquez really always liked the input from Stefan Bradl. Those two really got on really well, because I think Marc trusted Stefan to go, hey, if he says this is a problem, it's going to be a problem for me too. And if the feedback from him, their feedbacks were always similar, is what I'm trying to say. And so Stefan Bradl worked very well for Marc Marquez and his style at Honda. With Marc Marquez gone, are they looking to go a little bit of a different direction? I think the answer is yes. And not because Stefan Bradl is a bad motorcycle rider or a bad test rider, but for the same reason why you shake up management at a company or you hire new employees, is that you want to get new perspectives on things. And Stefan's been there a very long time. And now that they're kind of starting over at Honda, it makes a lot of sense that they may want to take just a new direction in general. Again, that requires kind of starting from the bottom. They're starting over, but they're kind of there already. If you look at the times this weekend for the Honda, Pedro Acosta crashed out of the race, remounted, and finished in front of the Hondas. So they are kind of a start from scratch organization. So it would make a lot of sense for Aleix to go over to Honda. So deal done, right? That's where he's going. Wait a minute. Because there's another Japanese manufacturer called Yamaha, who is trying very, very hard to get back to the front very quickly. Now, we all know that they have a pretty capable test rider named Cal Crutchlow, who's a good MotoGP rider, a recent MotoGP rider. Cal is a very honest guy. He, again, says what he thinks. And I think they're happy to have him. But when you're Yamaha and you don't have 2 more bikes on the grid to get information from, when you don't have a satellite team that can feed you information, you look at Ducati, they have 8 bikes on the grid. They've got 4 brand new bikes where they can look at the data every single weekend, and it can help them develop the next bike. And they're also looking at the evolution of the 2023. Don't think they aren't. They have 4 2023 bikes on the grid that they're still going, oh, you know what? That philosophy we use for that actually works better for the philosophy that we have in 2024. So they can take and mix and match technologies, and they can look at where their bike is improved and where it's fallen off. And they can take all this information from these 8 different motorcycles they have on the grid every single weekend and put it into practice back at the testing facilities and make that bike for 2025 and beyond so much better. Yamaha doesn't have that. They have 2 bikes on the grid, and that is it. So while they're working to improve the bike that's currently racing each weekend, they have to think toward the future. What are we doing for 2025, 2026, and 2027 when the regulations change? They need data. They need the Ducati thing that they're doing, but they just don't have the teams to do it. Unless they were able to pull it off, it's going to be a very, very long haul over there at Yamaha. So what better way to get that extra data was bring in another test rider, not to replace Cal Crutchlow, but to bring in a test rider to sit next to him for them to both test the bike and see the different data you can get from these different riding styles, from someone who rides like Cal and then someone who rides like Aleix, especially Aleix coming straight out of a MotoGP program. It makes all the sense in the world that they would want 2 riders in their testing program coming in to do wild cards 4 or 5 times a year. Aleix says he wants to still be in the MotoGP paddock 20 weeks a year down to 4 weeks a year. That's spending a lot more time with family, but still getting to ride a MotoGP bike. And now you're getting that data that you need without having to have the satellite team. I do think Yamaha is pushing very hard for the satellite team, but if they don't get it, the contingency plan has to be continuing to test very much, using these concessions, testing as much as they can. Another one at Mugello coming up, and getting wild cards, getting the bike on the track in the hands of people like Cal Crutchlow and Aleix Espargaro during a race weekend. And we saw that Cal Crutchlow, I can't remember his injury, has ruled him out of doing wild cards and tests right now. And so there, again, that's another thing. They're like, we're missing an opportunity here. And having a second really capable test rider in their stable would make a lot of sense for them going forward. It would make a lot of sense for them wanting that extra data. And again, you have someone like Cal Crutchlow who gets injured or sick and can't get to the wild card, then you have someone that can step in and is part of your program. So I think Yamaha also makes a lot of sense for Aleix Espargaro. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see very quickly this season at some point, incorporated into all this silly season, is that Aleix Espargaro signs with a Japanese manufacturer. And there's kind of a world where it's the only thing that makes sense. I don't see him going over to Ducati. I don't think they really need to pay a top dollar, hot off the presses MotoGP rider to be their test facility rider. They've got kind of things under control. I think KTM are very happy with Danny Pedrosa. They also have 4 bikes on the grid. They're taking a lot of feedback from Pedro Costa. You better believe that. So I just don't really see it. And he's already kind of said, yeah, it's probably not with Aprilia. Never say never, but I do think he's ready to close that chapter of his life and move on to new things. Let's talk about the dominoes that are going to fall with this Ducati decision, because everyone is talking about who's going to ride next to Pecco Bagnaia, and it's kind of the next roadblock in the silly season before anything else can happen. So I've said for the last couple of weeks, I think if Ducati, and this is an if Ducati's goal is to keep both Marc Marquez and Jorge Martin in the Ducati family, I think there's only a couple ways to do that. And not saying that they work. I don't know if this is a way, but I don't think there's one way they won't keep them in the family. Let's say that first. They have to put Jorge Martin on the red motorcycle next to Pecco Bagnaia in order to keep him in the Ducati family. If they do not give him the factory seat, Jorge Martin is going to KTM or he's going to Aprilia. I think case closed. You could see that if the Yamaha is really, really improving, he might look over there too and say, you know what? I'm a good enough rider to make that bike better. We can be competitive on a Yamaha as well. I think a lot of things that people are forgetting is the margins are pretty small in MotoGP. From the first to the last, it's a very small margin when you talk about like per lap times. And so a lot of times a rider goes, I can make the difference. If Yamaha is only 0.2 down from Ducati, I can make that difference. That's why you see talented riders going to manufacturers that may not be at the top of their game yet. So, well, why would they on earth would they go to Yamaha when they can go to Ducati? Well, they think they can make up the difference. That's why. And the differences are so small. 0.2 a lap, 0.3 a lap is a lot when you talk about 22 laps in a race. Suddenly you're 7 seconds off the lead and you're in 10th. But if you're a rider going, I can make up 0.3, my talent can bring me there. And if the bike gets better. So I wouldn't rule out Yamaha necessarily. Honda feels too lost for Jorge Martin to jump ship and go there. But the only way that Jorge Martin stays with Ducati is if he gets the red bike. So that is one thing. If Ducati is interested in keeping him and doesn't want him to going off to a competitor, they have to give him the red bike. So then how do you keep Marc Marquez? Marc Marquez says, I just want the latest machinery. I don't care what color the bike is. I don't care what team it is. I just want the latest machinery. Now, before I get too far down the road, we can talk about Enea Bastianini. I think I had said on this podcast before, keeping Enea at that factory seat is the least sexy of Ducati's options. It's just not a decision that grabs headlines and is exciting. I kind of considered he's kind of out of the running for it. And then after this weekend in Barcelona, I am 100% convinced that Enea Bastianini already knows himself. I don't think he would have defied those long lap penalties and finished outside of the points on the factory team on purpose if he didn't already think the fight for his future was over with them, because he let his emotions boil over a little bit there. But I do think he's kind of out of the running. It's a 2-horse race for this red bike. So Marc Marquez says, listen, I don't care if my GP25 is red. It just needs to be a GP25. I don't want to be in last year's machinery 2 years in a row. I want to compete at the front. He doesn't want to be qualifying 13th and coming through to the front every week. He wants to be qualifying on the first row and dominating MotoGP and racking up more points than anyone else and getting a 9th world title. So what are Ducati's options about giving him a 2025 GP? Well, Pramac Racing has a spot open with Jorge Martin leaving. Fermin Aldeguer is probably going to slot in there next to him. They give 2 GP25s to Pramac Racing. Mark gets one of them. He's now in the Pramac team racing next to Fermin Aldeguer next season. Deal done, right? Not necessarily. Because there's also an option that they give 1 GP25 to Pramac and they give 1 GP25 to Gresini. Gresini's earned it. You look at what Gresini has done, taking that team from a mid back of the pack race team, the smallest team on the grid, to winning races with Enea Bastianini, winning races with Fabio Di Giannantonio, winning podiums with Marc Marquez and Alex Marquez. Gresini's become a name in the paddock that we're used to seeing near the front now. We wouldn't have said that a few years ago. They were kind of happy to be there, and now they're happy to compete. So there's a version that they want to keep Gresini a little happy. They're the smallest team, but they've got this deal with both Marquez brothers. Mark is happy. He loves riding next to his brother. He loves working with Frankie Carcetti. So there's a version where he stays and wants to stay with Gresini, wants the GP25 to come to him, rather than having to kind of uproot his paddock life and move across to another team, which could be a big deal. How much of his garage would he be able to take with him from Gresini over to Pramac? Is Gresini really going to let Frankie Carcetti go over to Pramac and just chill? I don't think so. And we saw the difference. I don't want to understate what Frankie means to the riders he's with, because we saw the difference of Fabio Di Giannantonio year one with Gresini, where he was kind of nowhere and he just couldn't figure out the bike. He was mentally not there. He was not fast. Frankie comes in and immediately Fabio starts making steps. And by the end of last season, we saw Di Giannantonio making just giant leaps forward in his MotoGP career. He went from off the grid to the hottest rider on the grid. And we've seen him continue that now with VR46. And I don't think it's in small part to what Frankie Carcetti is able to bring to a rider with data analysis and experience and just a steady hand. So it makes a lot of sense that Mark would be like, hey, I'm happy here with Gresini. Let me have the 2025 bike. Again, I don't want to go to it. I want it to come to me. We're talking about a superstar here. He can make demands. A lot of riders in his position can't. I think if we're looking at someone like Fabio Di Giannantonio or Alex Marquez, and they were performing well, and they said, hey, I want a 2025, Ducati says, well, here, you have to beat to our drum to get the motorcycle you want. This is not an ordinary motorcycle rider. This is Marc Marquez. He can dictate terms a little more than most riders. So if he really wants to stay with Gresini, he wants to keep his brother in the paddock with him, he has a little bit of bargaining power himself, saying, I want things to come to me. I don't want to go to them. Now, what domino does that knock over? We know that Pramac Racing, or at least we think, we're pretty sure, we know, I'll say we know. We know that Pramac Racing was in talks with Yamaha to be the satellite team, to leave Ducati and move over to be a satellite Yamaha team. Now you have, on one side, you have Ducati giving you the best motorcycle on the grid, being competitive, winning a team title last year as an independent racing team. The sponsorship's got to be great from that. The TV exposure is huge. And on the other side, you have a struggling manufacturer that is looking for data, who is trying to give you a really sweetheart deal, leasing the motorcycles to you for free, possibly for 3 years, basically till the end of these current regulations, and maybe even into the first year of the next regulations. Yamaha's saying, you can have the bike for free. You don't have to pay us a dime. That's a big freaking deal when you're coming to looking at these bikes. $2 million a year to lease these motorcycles, $3 million a year. So that's not a small number when you're looking at a budget and you're Pramac Racing going, well, where can we take that $3 million and use it among our team? to help us be better, or to put it in our back pockets and have a really good lunch. So there's a decision to be made. So if Ducati goes to Pramac and says, hey, next year you're getting one GP25 for Fermin Aldeguer, and you're getting one GP24, because the other GP25 is going to Gresini. What does that do to Pramac? Well, now Pramac says, wow, wait a minute. Are we the second tier team in Ducati? Are we the first satellite team, or are we now competing with Gresini for that position? Why are they getting this treatment? Because they have Marc Marquez? Okay. So they're starting to feel a little, I don't know, miffed, but they would feel a little overlooked. They would feel, hey, look at all we've done for Ducati, helping you guys manage, helping you guys bring up riders that can go into the factory team and be successful, like Pecco. And so that might be a push for someone like Pramac to go, actually, rather than taking one GP25 and one GP24, we'll take two Yamahas, please. The deal's better. And a lot of people keep saying, well, why on earth would Pramac leave Ducati for Yamaha? That's a reason. That's not out of the ordinary. That's not crazy. Real cheap bike versus one great bike and one okay bike. Not okay. It's probably going to win a world title this year. So that's another domino that can fall. So then if Pramac goes to Yamaha, what's the domino that falls after that? Because we would now have, and this is, I mean, I'm in the weeds in speculation land here. So at that point, these dominoes would fall, and this goes, now you have Pecco and Martin at the factory, you have the Marquez brothers at Gresini, and then you have VR46 being the other Ducati, and you have Fermin Aldeguer, who has a Ducati contract. So one of the VR46 boys has to move aside. And so I think that is where the interest from this Ducati ride comes from, because it's not just as simple as who's Pecco's teammate. Much like when we were waiting for Fabio Quartararo to make his decision about Yamaha, MotoGP silly season is like a dam ready to burst. We were kind of waiting for what would happen if Fabio went to Aprilia. And now there's an open seat at Factory Yamaha, and then Factory Yamaha would be very aggressive in getting riders like Enea Bastianini or Jorge Martin or someone from KTM, be very, very aggressive in that. But because Fabio stayed with Yamaha, the floodgates didn't quite open the way we thought they would open after he made his decision. So now Ducati is the one holding the dam back. And now we're going to have to wait till that decision is made to see what happens and how those dominoes fall. Because everything I just said about Martin taking that factory seat and keeping Marc Marquez at Gresini, it's all what ifs. It's all ifs. It's all, well, I guess that could happen if they want to keep them both. There's also a version that they don't really care about keeping both of them. Ducati says, hey, we want Marc Marquez in the factory team. He's the bright, shiny new toy. Honda had him. We want the legend sitting next to Pecco. We want two world champions on our bike. And I'm sorry, Martin, you'll just have to go somewhere else and compete with us. We're fine with that. It's a risk, but we're okay with that. Thanks for the cookies. We're good. So it's just, there's so many options, but I think the reason that people keep talking about this so much is that it's just more than filling one seat. It is where the dominoes fall. And from the looks of it from the media, we thought they were going to fall this week in Mugello, and it doesn't look like Ducati is going to be making that decision that quickly. So we might have to be asking these questions for one more week. All right, so lastly, I want to talk about how it was something that came up this week, and someone had kind of said it in passing, and no one really picked up on it. But it really is that this, all the things I've talked about on the podcast this morning are a little bit of the problem that is happening in the MotoGP media room. I think there's a time and place to talk about everything when it comes to sports. And we only get so much access to the riders and the teams. There's only so much time to talk to them directly. So I understand why in the media room, a lot of the questions revolve around who's going to sit next to Pecco, Aleix retiring, you look at all the headlines this week, that's what it was. If you went back to the media day on Thursday and listened to the questions that were asked, so few of the questions that were asked had anything to do with racing. They had nothing to do, for the most part, with what was going on the track. All the media day questions were about Pecco, were about Jorge Martin and Marc Marquez and the factory contract and the next year and where do they go and Aleix's retirement and what do we feel and, all this stuff. So few questions directed at what's going on the track. And it got me thinking, I can't remember who said it, but they had referred to it kind of as the MotoGP subplot. But it does feel like, as far as the media is concerned, with the exception of on race day, the subplot in MotoGP has kind of become the plot. And I do think that once we get past silly season and once riders start making contract decisions, we're going to get back to the plot. And all of the media day questions will be about, what new parts are you bringing this week? Oh, what new parts are you bringing? What new upgrades? Because they love to talk about upgrades. But right now, it does feel like the subplot, the behind the scenes, the stuff off track, is the tail that's wagging the MotoGP dog as far as the media is concerned. And I think a lot of us need to stop and pause just for a second sometimes and really refocus back on the racing, because we are being spoiled with racing that is fantastic this season. We have people that are competitive at the front, all in the same year, all on really good bikes, all making their way together, exchanging wins, exchanging podiums, exchanging sprints. And I think it's important to realize that it's not always going to be like that. It's not going to be like that every season. We're getting a really exciting race season in the midst of this really exciting silly season. And I think sometimes we need to refocus on the plot of MotoGP, and that is what happens on the track. The fact we had Raul Fernandez leading a sprint race, a guy who I had considered done in MotoGP. And that's also part of the problem. We expect these guys to come in and be fast immediately and be rookie superstar Fabio Quartararo, rookie wonder boy Pedro Acosta, and anyone who's not doesn't deserve to be there. We almost saw it with Fabio Di Giannantonio. 2 seasons in, they're like, he's done. Yeah. You had your shot, kid. And now he's running at the top 5 in MotoGP races. He's beating guys that we consider MotoGP staples. He's finishing in front of Viñales, Jack Miller, Miguel Oliveira, Brad Binder, Pedro Acosta. He's finishing in front of all these guys. Yeah, but he's not good enough to be in MotoGP. Doesn't even deserve a seat. That's what was being thrown around last year. Oh man, who's taking his seat? It wasn't where is he going to ride? It was who's going to take his seat. So we had Raul Fernandez leading a sprint race for the first time this season. Now, whether that is because Aprilia found electronic setup that finally suits his riding style, that he's getting used to the Aprilia, that he's becoming a more mature rider, whatever it is, who cares? He's getting faster. And that's awesome. As an American, to see Trackhouse Racing leading a Grand Prix, awesome. But how many articles were written about that this morning, on Monday morning, or on Sunday night? I think the only one I really saw was how frustrated he was with throwing that lead away, with crashing out of the lead. And so it's hard to do because the juicy drama of it all comes from the track. But I do think it's good for us as fans of the sport to, I'm not saying these headlines should go away. I've just spent 40 minutes talking about the Ducati behind the scenes decisions and what's going to happen with Aleix in retirement. I don't think that stuff should go away. I just think that we all should just take a pause sometimes and go, hey, the racing on the track's really, really good right now. What happened in Barcelona, was an exciting weekend. Whether or not you don't appreciate that the top 3 guys crashed out of the race in the sprint, but it was a really tricky race. And I want to just tip my hat in that sprint race to the way Aleix Espargaro handled it, and also the way Jorge Martin handled it. I saw some comments online, Twitter or X or Reddit or whatever, they were talking about, oh man, Jorge Martin really didn't push. He really wasn't competitive. He didn't really move forward in that race. And my comment back was, Aleix was praised for his patience in the sprint. He was praised for understanding the conditions that were out there and how fast he could go. And then he kind of adjusted accordingly. And then he won the race. Jorge Martin had the exact same race. He was just starting a little further back. And he wasn't in a position to win the race. But he did the same thing. He was looking at those riders in front of him going down, going, hey, I just got to keep it up. I got to run a pace that I know I can finish the race, bank these points. This is not a weekend to just push, and throw it away, especially when you see Pecco crash and go, well, there's my championship coming to me. And so I think it was a really mature race from Jorge Martin, not a disappointing race in any stretch of the imagination. I think hats off. I mean, he's always been kind of, the criticism around him has been, he's kind of hot-tempered. He kind of just twists it hard and just go, go, go. But I think he rode with his head a lot this weekend. I think Raul Fernandez showing some promise. Pedro Acosta showing some growing pains. But should we also be talking about the fact that this dude got up off the floor on that KTM? He said had some technical issues with the bike. Who knows what that is, or if he's just a rookie not wanting to take the blame. I don't care. He gets off the floor on that motorcycle and then finishes in the points. A lot of things happen. We're not talking about Fabio Quartararo finishing ninth. I think he actually might even finish. No, it was ninth place. He finished ninth place after the Enea being booted out with his penalties. And coming out of that weekend going, we don't feel horrible about that on the Yamaha. We felt like we had pace in this race. They're still missing stuff. They're still growing. They've got parts coming. They've got more tests. They've got more wild cards. They've got stuff going on at Yamaha. But the fact he's back in the top 10, like Yamaha's starting to separate themselves a little bit, or at least Fabio is, from Honda on the track. Look at what Alex Rins did, getting himself into Q2. I think he was 7th on the grid this week. I mean, into Q2s. Like, he was riding in the top 10. He was there. Horrible start, bad mistake. But these are the things that we can't forget is what we actually watch. And while the silly season and Ducati's decision and Aleix's retirement are all nice icing on the cake, it's not the cake. So enjoy the cake too. That does it here for Monday Morning MotoGP. Again, this is live on TikTok at 10 a.m. every Monday after a Grand Prix weekend. And if you miss it live, you can watch the full podcast in its entirety on YouTube later Monday. So thank you so much for joining me. For those who are joining me live here on TikTok, we're going to take a little bit. We're going to answer some questions. We're going to talk to the people out there. I saw some things in the chat come up through the podcast, but I was too busy blabbing to really address it. But yeah, make sure you're joining me here every Monday after a MotoGP Grand Prix weekend. And make sure you're liking here, follow, share, mash all the buttons, and then go over to YouTube and subscribe so you get the full-length podcast there as well if you miss it here live. Thank you so much for listening.